Hello and welcome to the Bible Standard. In a gripping exploration of history and prophecy, this series delves into the enduring saga of the Jewish people, tracing the chilling thread of anti-Semitism that has woven through nearly 2,000 years of human history. From the burning of synagogues in the 4th century to the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, this video unveils a sobering timeline of persecution, massacres, expulsions and slanders that have targeted Jews across Europe and beyond. Yet, amidst this dark chronicle, the narrative highlights a profound truth: the uncanny fulfillment of Bible prophecy, foretold thousands of years ago in the scriptures, like Deuteronomy 28, which vividly describes the trembling hearts and relentless fears endured by a scattered people. With meticulous historical detail, from the Crusades to Napoleon's unfulfilled promises and Martin Luther's troubling legacies, this series sets the stage for understanding how these events have shaped the modern Middle East and the remarkable resilience of Israel, revealing a story of suffering, survival, and the undeniable hand of destiny. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and drop us a comment in the comment section to have your say.
Multi-part presentation on the subject of how a terrorist, a temple, and a Texas red cow started a war. Elements of this, I'm sure, will be familiar to many viewers, but we've endeavoured to put this together in a little series just to highlight how the scriptures are being fulfilled in the circumstances that are going on in the Middle East. And we'll work our way through this in sections. So first of all, we have to consider the context. Again, a familiar context to us. It's the Middle East, it's Israel, but there's some additional points we want to make. Because sitting at the background of everything that's happening in the Middle East, which is abundantly clear over all the major nations of the earth right now, is the eternal hatred of the Jew that is emerging. And I just want to go through very quickly a bit of a summary of the anti-Semitism that's gone on in the world over nearly 2,000 years. Now, this is such a broad subject, you can hardly do it justice at all. But if you are interested, you'd like to go into Wikipedia and look up the timeline of anti-Semitism, you'll find that in just about every century, there have been several accounts of major anti-Semitic activities somewhere in Europe, which has involved the massacre of Jewish people or persecution of Jewish people, either literally physically putting them to death or herding them into ghettos or otherwise making their life an absolute misery. And during that time, there have been times when there has been great prosperity for Jews, and they've done exceptionally well, but only for a very short time, and then the anti-Semitism returns, and that is exactly what we're seeing in the world today. So one of the first examples of anti-Semitism in the world, and we're looking here particularly at the world of Christianity and their contribution to anti-Semitism, because there is certainly historical data around persecution of the Jews by non-Christians. But just the Christians alone give a terrible record, a terrible history of persecution of Jewish people. So one of the first recorded accounts of Jewish persecution by the Christian community of a physical nature, and I'm quoting here from a book on the subject of Christian persecution of the Jews by Dr. Jason Hensley, which I thoroughly commend. In his book, he signals this particular event as one of the early times of persecution of a physical kind. And it was when a Christian mob led by a local bishop, supported by the Archbishop of Milan, burned down a synagogue. And interestingly enough, tragically though, the Pope, when he heard about this, was quite upset about it all and suggested, they commanded that the Christians rebuild the synagogue, but they didn't. Pressure was brought to bear on the Pope, and it was explained that this would be a really bad idea, and so they didn't rebuild it. And persecution of the Jews by the Christians was to continue. Now, historically, you find that during the history of the Jews, they were emancipated. That is to say, they were set free from some of the restrictions that were put on them that took the form of persecution in former days. But it was kind of variable across the nations of Europe. And whilst we're not going to go into that in a lot of detail, because again, this is such a massive subject, we just want to highlight a few things. So before they were emancipated, and some weren't emancipated, that is set free, and perhaps just to elaborate on that, the Jews had lived in Europe, in countries, for hundreds and hundreds of years and never had citizenship. So one of the acts of emancipation was to give them citizenship, and that started in France in the days of Napoleon and was still continuing on up until the 20th century in places like Spain, where emancipation came very late for the Jews there. But so prior to emancipation, though, in most countries where the Jews were residing, there were lots of restrictions put on them. They had to wear special clothing. They had to wear, for example, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 enforced in some places that Jews should wear a special badge or yellow star on their clothing. Others insisted they should wear a special hat that distinguished them. So people should tell the difference between Jews and Christians. They weren't allowed to vote in those countries where voting existed. And in some countries like Norway, Denmark, and Spain, they were prohibited to even enter those countries. So this is just one little example of the kind of person that went on. They were forced to live in ghettos in many places. They were herded. Now, the reasons for this were born from terrible prejudices and inexplicable reasoning, if you really go searching for it to try and understand what happened. There was a whole bunch of things that called the Slanders against the Jews. And those slanders included things like the accusation that they captured Christian children to drain their blood and use their blood to make matzo, the material that made unleavened bread. And there was even an accusation on that score as late as the country rose in 1840. But it continued all from 1144 all the way through. They were accused of poisoning wells. They were accused of crop failure. They were accused of being responsible for the Great Plague, even though they themselves suffered from the consequences of the Black Plague as much as anybody else did. Perhaps not to the same degree, but they certainly suffered. And the Jews' response to this generally was to take a fairly passive approach. Rarely did they fight back. When they did, interestingly enough, the persecution often stopped. But generally speaking, they didn't. They allowed themselves to be treated in this appalling way, and they were generally passive, which in turn empowered their enemies even more. They're forbidden to own land in many countries. They're forbidden to be farmers or be involved in most trades. And so money lending became their main source of employment, because under church law, Christians couldn't charge interest if they lent loans to other Christians. So there was not very little incentive to do that. So it became the province of the Jews, and they became very good at that. One of the ironies of all the persecution that went on in the Dark Ages was that when they drove the Jews out of a country, they drove out the financial expertise of the village or town from which they were chased. And so the economy of those areas invariably fared badly as a result of their eviction. This picture here is depicting the Strasbourg massacre in February 1349, when an entire Jewish community of several thousand Jews were publicly burnt to death as part of the Black Death persecutions. The Jews in Strasbourg were forbidden by local law and often canon law to own land or to be farmers. And hence, as we mentioned, they got involved in money lending. But here we have massive persecution because they're taking the brunt of the fear and stress of the Black Plague. And then along came the Crusaders, and one of the popes, the newly appointed pope in 1095, Pope Urban II, thought it was a really wonderful idea if a bunch of knights in shining armour could band together and take themselves across to the Middle East and dispatch the Muslims who were polluting the holy place in Jerusalem. And so this was thought about to be a grand idea. There'd be great opportunities for rape and pillage and collection of bullion to return. And so with this lust raging in their veins, the Crusaders set off on their first crusade. But it wasn't long before they realised that they were passing by some local infidels in the form of the Jewish community. So why go all the way to Jerusalem when you can plunder them here and take their wealth and persecute them and destroy them whilst on the way to the Holy Land, as they called it. So the effect of the crusade, as we say there on the slide, was devastating. The Jews were targeted throughout the Rhineland, and they entirely eliminated the Jewish population in many places. So in some cases, to be fair, they offered them the option of converting to Christianity or to be killed just the same. On one occasion, 500 Jews were burnt to death in a tower by the Crusaders. King Edward I issued what came to be called the Edict of Expulsion. And the same day that the edict was proclaimed, writs or letters were sent to his sheriffs advising that all Jews in their countries had until the 1st of November to leave the realm. I ask you to picture what that would be like. I asked you to imagine that you'd been living in this place for centuries and you're reasonably well established despite the restrictions that you exist under. And then one day the king decides that it's time for you to go. Now, no one knows exactly why the king suddenly got it in his head to do this, but some suggest it was because one of his courtiers or someone he knew, a man named Robert of Reading, converted to Judaism and married a Jewish woman. And this terrified the king and annoyed him greatly, and hence that stimulated his desire to get rid of all the Jews out of England. Now, there's not a lot of places you can go if you're kicked out of the United Kingdom. And so you're in boats and you're selling up all your property as whatever you've got. If you've got any property, you're trying to liquidate your funds. You're taking your family, your children, your wife, extended relatives, and you are trying to flee the realm. And if we really get behind that and connect with the emotions and the stress that would be involved in such a thing, you can understand why the words of Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 65 become very relevant. Because God predicted all the suffering and persecution that you see in the world today of the Jewish people was predicted by God in the Bible thousands of years ago. We're not going to go into why God did that, although we will go into what God promised to do about it in a later session. But for the moment, we just want to paint a picture of just how bad things were. And so we have this quote in Deuteronomy 28, verse 65, "Among those nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shalt the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind." What a terrible situation to be in. And yet, throughout Europe, these expulsions happen from time to time, and people had to uproot everything they had and try and find a country that will allow them in again. And as we mentioned, the great libel concerning the plague, Jews conspired with the devil to create the Black Plague. So 1 in 2 people in Europe died in 1349 of the Black Plague, and this picture depicts Jews being burnt to death as a punishment because of their supposed involvement in causing the Black Plague to come upon Europe. And as we mentioned, they single the Jews out probably because they would anyway, but because they seem to be affected less by the plague than the average person. The Jews were expelled from Vienna by the Holy Roman Emperor and subsequently forbidden to settle in Austria in the hereditary lands. And their goods were expropriated and given to the Catholic citizens. So now we're into 1670 as we're moving from 388. Now we're in 1670 thereabouts. And so this created the wandering Jew phenomena of the Jews being moving around from place to place. This is a map of organised massacres that occurred in what we would probably know now as the Ukraine. And Ukraine had a huge Jewish population. And every green dot there represents a pogrom or a massacre that took place of the Jewish people. They used to call this place the covenant land. On the next slide, we can see the countries from which the Jews were chased. And again, the words of Deuteronomy come to mind, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have no assurance of thy life. So these are the countries they fled from, the black areas, and the red areas are where they fled to, the resettlement areas. What a terrible time. What a horrible existence that these people had to endure. Is there any nation anywhere on the earth who for such an extended period of time had to wander around looking for a country that will allow them to find a place to live? This picture depicts the time of Napoleon, when Napoleon became very sympathetic to the Jews, and particularly when he was running his campaign in the Middle East in the battle against Acre, just above the land of Israel, or just near the land of Israel. And he became quite interested in trying to co-opt the Jews into fighting with him. Now, of course, today we're told by certain elements in the Palestinian community that Jews haven't been in the land since 1948 or thereabouts, but in fact they were there in 1799. In fact, they've been there since Abraham entered the land. Anyway, Napoleon thought it would be a good idea to co-opt the Jews to help him in his battles, and he promised to make Jerusalem a homeland for the Jews if he won the battle. Well, that's what history says, but he lost the battle and he then forgot about the promise he made. But it was interesting that a Jewish person from Gaza, from the area of Gaza, not the actual town, but from Gaza generally, went to see Napoleon to ask him if he was indeed the Messiah who'd come to save the nation of Israel. And Napoleon allegedly said, no, I'm just the forerunner, which is kind of an interesting comment. But then we come on to Martin Luther. So we've been focusing on the Catholics and how they persecuted the Jews and how terrible they were really, and so unchristian, if you like, in their dealings with the Jewish people. But look at what Martin Luther had thinking. So Martin Luther is the great reformer, the person who was bringing the Catholic Church to account for its corruption, both in practice and in teaching. But unfortunately, he carried with him all the same prejudices that existed in previous times. We're going to come back to this a little bit later to explain how they justified this in one of our later talks. But we'll just highlight it now in just a minute after we read what's on the slide in front of us here, because this was Luther's teaching about what should be done with the Jews. So what shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is to be done in honour of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. What a remarkable attitude. Second, I advise that their houses be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and live. And he went on. There were several more. That's all I thought was necessary to make the point. So what Luther did and what the church had done from early days was to do what was called succession. And by that was meant that all the verses in the Bible that spoke about the good things that would happen to the Jews would be applied to the Christians. They superseded, if you like, the Jewish people in the scripture. So the Jewish people then became redundant. And we'll return to this point a bit later just to see how terrible that doctrine was. But it was a well-established doctrine of supersessionism, as they called it, or replacement theology. And so this then justified them to say, well, the Jews are a rejected people. God hates them. We should hate them. Let's kill them. And that's precisely what they did. And this was acknowledged, in fact, in more recent times. In fact, in 2001, there was a national conference of Catholic bishops, and this statement was made. But Christian anti-Judaism did lay the groundwork for racial, genocidal anti-Semitism by stigmatizing not only Judaism, but Jews themselves for opprobrium and contempt. So the Nazi theories tragically found fertile soil in which to plant the horror of an unprecedented attempt at genocide. The same genocide, in fact, is being called for right now in various parts of the world. And this was stated at the National Conference of Catholic Bishops under the title of Catholic Teaching on the Shoah, which is the Holocaust, implementing the Holy See's We Remember in 2001. So you can see it's still very much in the conscience of the church as they look back at their appalling treatment of Jewish people and the total lack of any Christianity in any of their behaviours. Now, just to keep us in the context of the Bible, the point we want to drive home here, and I know many of you already know this, but we've got to keep it in the forefront of our mind, that this was all predicted in the Bible. And if you ask me for some of the reasons why I believe the Bible to be true and believe there's a God in heaven, ironically, it's because of the terrible suffering of the Jewish people, because it was so prophesied. And you just can't seem to get away from that. And we'll see from other verses as we go on in our little series, just how accurate the Bible teaching and prophecies have been in relation to this people and how it shouts out that this is the work of God. And so it says, Deuteronomy 28, verse 37, and thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations whither the Lord shall lead thee. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shalt thou the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. Thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have no assurance of life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even. And at even thou shalt say, would God it was morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes that thou shalt see. Now maybe there are some viewers who live in a part of the world where they have known fear in the sense of a force that is out to destroy them, that hates them. That regardless of age, gender, occupation, behaviour, you are singled out for destruction simply because of your birth. Can you even begin to imagine what that must feel like to live in that kind of context? I remember reading a book on Golda Meir, a woman who was to become the first female Prime Minister of Israel. And then she grew up in the Pale of Settlement in Ukraine, which I referred to earlier, where all the persecutions were. And she talks about her father boarding up the house windows and the noise of people in the streets and the terror of wondering whether it was going to be your house, that today they're going to break down the door and drag you out into the street and mutilate you in some terrible way. And that was when she was just a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years of age. Fortunately, her parents took her out of there and they went to America, and eventually Golda ended up in Israel. But what a terrible time. Surely we can find some pity in our hearts for anyone who has to live in that kind of world. And yet the people of Israel today in various places have to endure that every day, where over the last 20 years, 20,000 rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel. Then, of course, history repeated itself. Nazi Germany came into being. The Jews were singled out for total annihilation. And the badge that was worn hundreds and hundreds of years ago was reinstituted. And the Jews were driven into ghettos. And it was a subtle process. First, they were denied their citizenship. Then their businesses were attacked. Then their homes were attacked. goods were confiscated, then they were driven into ghettos, and then finally they were loaded into cattle trucks and carted off to concentration camps. And how powerfully the words of the scriptures began to come to pass. So what we have in this picture here is a selection of Hungarian Jews on the ramp at Auschwitz, which was in German-occupied Poland back in 1944. During the final phase of the Holocaust, Jews were sent either to work or to the gas chambers. And the photograph here is part of a collection known as the Auschwitz album, which was donated to the Museum of Jewish History. People you can see here, people holding babies, ordinary folk, ordinary men and women. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what's going to happen. They have an ominous feeling of dread, but they can't believe they're going to be killed. They can't believe that anyone would do such a barbaric thing as to implement wholesale murder of thousands of people, and yet that's exactly what was happening. Imagine a discussion between the guards here, these German guards. You can see in the front of the picture, the people have been separated into males and females, with the children staying with the women, and they are going off to a concentration camp. You can imagine the conversation, one guard to another. So what's going on here? Where do you think these people are going? Oh, I know where they're going. They're going to concentration camps, going to Auschwitz or one of the other camps. Yeah, but what do they do there? What happens to them? Well, some of them work, he says, with just his voice trailing away. What, all of them? All of these people? How do you put all of these people to work? Oh, well, not all of them, of course. Only about 25% are really fit for work. Well, what happens to the rest? Well, within an hour or so of arrival, most of them will go into a gas chamber. Their clothes will be taken off them. In some cases, the women's hair will be shaved and collected. All their goods will be removed. Their wedding rings, all their clothing, anything of value, their shoes will all be collected. I can't believe that, the other guard says. Surely not. I wouldn't make any comments about it if I were you. 25% of that group there, of these harmless, innocent people, will go to the workhouse and work themselves to death while the rest would be killed. Look at the fear in the face of these people, the uncertainty, the little children. Jewish women and children deported from Hungary, separated from men, line up for selection in Auschwitz, Germany. The camp authorities sent the vast majority of young Jewish children directly to the gas chamber upon arrival in Auschwitz and in other centres. Within 60 minutes, most of the people in that picture would have died after they'd lost all their clothing. Some of the women would have lost their hair. Sometimes they cut the hair off the bodies after they were dragged out of the gas chambers. Some had their hair shaven off before. And the hair was collected and sold to local manufacturers, probably of mattresses and pillows and other things. And people could go to beds and dream sweet dreams on the hair of women who'd just recently been gassed to death in the gas chambers. After the war, and of course you have to realise that during the whole Nazi exercise, people, whenever the Nazis came to town, they wanted to know where the Jews were. And so the locals would point the finger over there, not us, over there. And in some cases, Hitler just wrote to the various countries and said, send all your Jews to such and such a place. And there are records published in American newspapers toward the end of the war saying how many tens of thousands of Jews came from each town or country and were sent to Poland and to other places for the gas chambers. It's the most horrific thing. It's unimaginable. And so the Allies, when they got into the camps, forced the locals who had been passively complicit in this whole terrible event to come and look at the bodies. By contrast, we have this picture. These are folk who worked in Auschwitz. These are some of the guards and the auxiliary staff, and there was a good career opportunity here. There were good money, there were good social activities, it was a fun working environment, and your job was simply processing Jewish people to their annihilation. And this particular picture is taken of a group of workers who are having a bit of time off at a place called Hut, which is a retreat in Poland not far from Auschwitz, where they used to go for recreation. There were 8,400 workers running the Auschwitz camp. These are just some of them, and this is the morale that they enjoyed during this unbelievable time in human history. 232,000 children among the total number of children sent to Auschwitz. The exact number who were killed remains unknown. However, on a single day on October 10th, 1944, 800 children were gassed to death. And here's another picture of our friends enjoying themselves with some refreshments, also in one of the retreats. But the Allies, infuriated by all of this, forced these women and men to come out from their offices once the Allies had taken over and forced them to pick up the bodies, to handle the bodies that they processed, that were just to them paperwork, and to throw their bodies into this mass grave that was being prepared. They disposed of 10,000 corpses in a mass grave. In this picture, we can see shoes that have been collected. Here are spectacles that were collected, and here a whole box of wedding rings. And here, children being lined up on their way to the gas chambers. And if you say, well, why didn't people fight? Well, they deceived them. They told them they were going to the gas chambers to be deloused because of all the lice that would have crawled all over them in the cattle trucks as they brought them there. And they were going to have this nice shower and they'd feel better afterwards. And I'm quite sure many of them did not believe that, but they were probably too numb and too overcome with disbelief that any of this could actually be happening and that it could end the way it did. And of course, up there in the corner, we have Himmler, who was the architect of the final solution. Because before the gas chambers got into play, they used to take the Jews out and shoot them and bury them in the woods or put them in the back of trucks and pipe exhaust fumes into the truck and kill them that way. But it was very inefficient and the bullets cost money. So mass murder in the form of the gas chambers was the way to go. Anti-Semitism is exactly the same as delousing. Getting rid of lice is not a question of ideology, it's a matter of cleanliness. In just this same way, anti-Semitism for us has not been a question of ideology, but a matter of cleanliness. And frankly, if you look at the language or listen to the language of the protesters right now, Free Palestine, death to the IDF and so forth that's going on, they have a similar attitude. Now, whether they could actually put it into practice the way Hitler did in such a cold-blooded way, you'd like to hope they couldn't. But nevertheless, it's chilling when you hear some of the things that are being said at the moment and screamed out over megaphones in public squares and harbour bridges. When you hear that kind of rhetoric, you just wonder. In this picture, we have some bodies being burnt by what they call the Sondo commanders. And the Sondo commanders were Jewish prisoners whose job it was to pull the bodies out of the furnaces or out of the gas chambers and remove anything of value left on the bodies by way of wedding rings or hair or teeth with gold in them. Their job was to do that and then burn the bodies. And of course, they knew that they would end up exactly the same way. And this was the mastermind of the whole proceeding. I am, as before, a Catholic and always will remain so. Interestingly, the Mufti of Jerusalem met with Hitler because he thought what Hitler was doing was a splendid exercise and was hoping that maybe they could help out some way and maybe Hitler could get rid of the Jews that were still in Palestine at the time. So I think we've made our point about the horrors of anti-Semitism down through time. And of course, despite all the evidence, despite all the pictures of all the piles of bodies and clothing and wedding rings and spectacles and the mountain of evidence that is around, there is in the world dozens and dozens of Holocaust deniers. People are going to say it just didn't happen. I'm not going to go into detail on this man because he doesn't deserve it, but he represents the Holocaust deniers. And he also boasts about the fact that he's still getting people taking an interest in his stuff, interest in his lies that he has so widely published. And he's a testimony to the ability of the human mind, when it is filled with sufficient animosity towards a particular group, to believe anything at all. And that's been his mission in life, by casting doubt on the Holocaust. And of course, he just flares into flame the whole anti-Semitic movement. All right, so what has this achieved? If we go back to AD 38 and the burning of the synagogue way back there in Milan, and we go through all the pogroms and persecutions and sufferings and ghettos and everything, what has been achieved? What has been accomplished? Well, something very significant has been accomplished, and this is it. That's the massive achievement. That's what the Holocaust brought into being. Without Hitler, this probably never would have happened. This and this and this. So what we want to do in our next session is look at how this came about, because it wasn't what Hitler accomplished. He certainly drove the people back to the land. He certainly made it possible for what we're looking at right now on the slide to come to pass. But to get to this particular point, a few more things had to happen. So this is the context. Then we're going to move on to the beginning of terrorism. Then we're going to talk about the terrorists. Then we're going to talk about the temple. And finally, we're going to talk about the Texan red cow.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.